good in these circumstances. We worked hard before to get the slides all in the right order, and now we're in the wrong order, aren't we? So I shall introduce myself just while we're getting the slides sorted. But you do actually have in your pack the slides that we're going to go through. So if we don't get it up and running, we can actually read the notes. Right, lovely, thank you. So as we just said, my name's Nicola, and I run a group called Braveheart Education, and we train primarily schools around the country to understand vulnerable children, particularly those who've been through the care system, may be adopted, or may still be in difficult home environments. We try and get schools to understand what's different about them, how they might need to approach them in a different way. Education is really difficult, as some of you will know, for children who just don't kind of fit that usual mould. I'm seeing some agreement. And the reason why I do this is I'm actually an adoptive parent. So I have 3 children. They are 13 next week, 14 and 15. And they've been with us 8 years. So we've kind of been on a journey ourselves, as you can imagine. And I'm still on that journey, I would say, trying to understand what this actually means, what's different about our children, how do they respond differently, what are the messages they receive, what's their behaviour about. And they were children who grew up in a very chaotic home environment. The eldest, she was 5 when she went into care, so they had a long time in that kind of environment, and that has a huge impact on how they are now. So that's why I've kind of come into this work. And I'm very aware that as I'm talking to you this afternoon, this is a very varied, mixed audience. So I do apologise for those who I don't know, would like to shut off right now. You are perfectly welcome to. I can see you there, and I might point you out, put you on the video. But I hope that you'll get something from it that will inspire you if you want to find out more about attachment particularly and how it impacts on children. We are all on the attachment spectrum, actually, so for yourselves, often what I find is we don't just think about the families and children that you might be working with. It does make you think about your own experience, and that's okay. We're all on that journey together as well, aren't we? So I'm going to try and give you some content, and hopefully we'll have enough time. So can one of you ladies give me a 10 minutes to, that I've got left, so that I can make sure we get some points in. Okay, yep. So what we're going to look at, we're going to look a little bit at trauma and some of the risk factors around trauma. Some of you will be well aware of these things, I'm sure. We're going to talk about attachment theory and what it actually means. It's very misunderstood often. Brain development, it's very important to understand what happens in children's brain, particularly in those early years when they're in a very chaotic environment, and how that might impact on further development and on their learning. We're going to talk about attachment styles, because children express things in very different ways, so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to look at something called the parenting continuum, because a lot of you, I guess, are working with families. We're going to look at what might be different in how you parent children who've experienced early trauma particularly, because that can have a huge difference in their development. There's some further reading in your pack. If you want to look at, if you want to find out more, then there's a list at the back of your pack. Okay. Usually when I'm doing this kind of training, I like to have some questions and some interaction. I know we haven't got a lot of time to do that, but please, if you really want to ask a question and you're brave enough to do it in a group this size, please just put your hand up and I will try and answer it for you. So trauma, what do we mean by trauma when we're talking about trauma? Trauma by definition is 2 things that come together to create a trauma. And those 2 things are an external event, something that happens outside of a child. So if you think about domestic violence, for example, a child may be hit themselves, somebody else in the family may be hit, or there may be the prevailing atmosphere of aggression and violence. If you think about some of the rough estates around, where it's such a lovely surroundings today, I'm sure there are no rough estates in Hertfordshire, are there? There are where I'm from. Living in that environment can be quite stressful. So there's an external event, and then there's our internal response to that event. And that can be any number of things. If you think about siblings, particularly twins who experience things at the same time, often they have a very different response to that. There's obviously personality, temperament, lots of things involved in that. But those two things come together to create a trauma. And we talk about two different types of trauma. Type 1, which is a single episode, something like bereavement, or if a child experiences a terrible car accident, or they witness a violent attack, those kind of things. And type 2 trauma, which is repetitive trauma, and that's often what we're talking about more, where a child has experienced things again and again. Often these days when they go into the care system, obviously they'll have experienced, often it's neglect and abuse together in many cases, but they will have experienced things that have brought them out of that home environment. And as it says there, both types are the result of overwhelming, horrible external events of which the child has no control over. And that's really important to understand when you're trying to work with children like this, or families actually, because often parents may very well be these children grown up. It's that kind of cycle. But it's very helpful to understand that that sense of powerlessness is what can in the future, they desperately need to control their environment. The more anxious they become, the more controlling they may become, because we need to control to feel safe, and that's often what happens. My youngest son is very much like this. He's 12 at the moment, he's 13 next week, and the more anxious he becomes, he's really down to tiny details. It's usually about his sister. You know, she's breathing next to me. Well, can't do much about the breathing. It's those tiny, tiny little things that make it really hard for him. Because he needs to control in order to feel safe, and that can be quite hard for them. So let's look a little bit at some of the risk factors, and you will be aware of a lot of these, I'm sure, particularly those of you that are volunteers with Homestart. And we tend to think about this kind of age when we're thinking about this subject, but there's things that could have happened well before that you may not be aware of. So for example, I'm not going to go through all of these, I'll just pick out a few. So for example, pre-birth stress. When we're stressed, our bodies release a chemical called cortisol, and it flows through our system. And a certain amount of cortisol is okay. We tend to be able to manage that, and of course we're all different. So I'm sure for some of you, standing up here would be horrendous, because I know it's one of the biggest fears. It's not that bad for myself. But that, if you're doing something new for the first time, or you're lost somewhere, that kind of level of stress we tend to be able to manage. But if you imagine a mom who's in a very difficult home environment, she's got children she's already struggling to manage, she's got financial difficulties, she's got unhealthy relationships going on, and she's carrying, the amount of stress that she's feeling can be quite damaging to baby. That cortisol can go through the placenta, baby can be born with a higher stress level. And of course then they're quite difficult to look after. And for that initial relationship with mom, that can be quite difficult. Some of the other things that you might not think about, a baby being born premature, just consider that initial environment, how different that is when they go full term, straight onto mom, skin on skin contact, touch, the heartbeat, the voice, all those stimulating experiences. Often when they're born premature, they'll go into an incubator, there isn't the same level of touch. That can have a long-term impact. Separation or change of the primary caregiver. We used to believe years ago that if a baby was taken away from its parents at birth, that there wouldn't be any lasting impact. We now know that that's not always true. Sometimes that's true, but most of the time that isn't true. Do any of you watch the long lost family programs that are on TV? There's another lot at the moment, isn't there? I know they're quite difficult to watch. Typically they're people who were given up for adoption back in the 60s and 70s, spent their whole life trying to find out where they come from. Because there's something within us that wants to know that. Not always, but a lot of the times. The fact that we are not living with our birth parents can have a huge impact. And I mention that one often because people will say, oh, well, they were only 5 days old when they went into care, they won't remember anything. And they may not have cognitive memories, but we do have sensory memories, particularly smell. And the fact that they're not living with their birth parents and what might have happened before can still have an impact. I know I have many friends who had their adopted children when they were tiny babies, and they still have difficulties when they're growing due to a lot of things that happened before they're born. Okay, I think I'm going to leave the rest of those for people to look at. I'm sure that you will be aware of all of those things. So what is attachment? When we're talking about attachment, you may have heard this phrase. It's not about bonding, which is what we often think about. It's actually about what happened in those initial stages for a child, particularly before the age of 2. So in a healthy attachment style or cycle, what's supposed to happen is the baby has a need and they make that need known. So let's say they're hungry, they obviously don't know what that means, they've got icky feeling in their stomach, so they cry. And they keep crying until somebody comes and meets that need. And what we tend to do is we pick them up, we tell them how they're feeling. You must be really hungry, let's give you some food, we feed them, we spend time with them, and we do that enough, what we call good enough parenting, which you've probably heard that phrase, so that the child understands that their needs are going to be met. And what happens for the baby is trust starts to develop. They start to understand the world is a safe place, I am okay, and my needs will be met. And statistics tell us, this is a long time ago actually, I'd love to get the current ones, that about 60% of people will have had that kind of experience. So that implies that 40% will not have had good enough parenting that leads to a secure attachment style. On the other side then, if you have a disturbed attachment cycle, what happens is baby has a need, and they make that need known, and then more often than not it's inconsistent in its response. So one time they might be fed, they might be ignored, they might be shouted at, of course they might be hit. My daughter talks of a time when she needed the toilet and she was shouted at, and she wets herself and she shouted at for that. Now if that continues time and time again, what happens for baby is trust doesn't develop, but rage develops instead. And they get a really deep feeling at the core of their being that says, I am bad. They internalise it into shame. And a lot of the behaviours that you see in children later on in life is to do with that underlying emotion of shame. Whether it's lying, blaming other people, minimising, rage, running away and hiding. Lots and lots of behaviours that I hear, particularly in schools, is actually coming from that place of shame. Okay, so we're just going to do a little exercise. And this is going to be quite challenging. I'm going to go this side, but that's okay. We don't mind that, do we? So we're going to think about different stages of development for children, and I'm going to need to ask for all your help in saying what you think the things that children need at different stages of development. So, 0 to 6 months, if you want to shout out in an orderly fashion what you think children need. So no PlayStations or Wii's or TVs or anything like that, please. iPads. Cuddles, okay, good. Food, yeah. Sleep. That's for you as well, isn't it? Everybody needs sleep. Yeah.
What's the posh word for being regimented, like a regular
routine?
That's
Don't know if it's a posh word. Yeah, don't give me any words I can't spell. Okay. Warm. Yeah. Physical and emotional warmth, isn't it? Comfort, did I hear? Yeah. What else? Two more. Shelter. Hygiene, yeah. Okay, and with that, I'd say kind of medical stuff as well, isn't there? Keeping their doctor's appointments. I know we've got some health visitors over in the room. No? I thought we did. Okay, so moving on to 6 months to 2 years. So obviously they're going to need all of the same things there. But what's different about this stage of development? Play, yeah. That's important. You'd think that they would just know how to play, but actually often we need to...
Communication.
Yeah, so language is starting, isn't it? Yeah. Communication.
Interaction with other members of the family.
Yeah.
being read to.
Yeah. Reading. Stimulation. Yeah. Safety. Praise. Yeah. Stimulation.
Love.
So what do we have? Love and boundaries. Let's have boundaries on this one. I think that's when it does start to become more important, isn't it? When they're moving around and there's more things going on. And somebody said love, yeah? Because it's a difficult one to define anyway, isn't it, what that actually looks like. So 2 to 5 years, what's different about this stage of development? Rules? Socialising, yeah. So they're starting to meet more people, aren't they? Down here it tends to be the very close family, and then, like you said, somebody said, interacting with the wider world. So what did somebody just say? Socialising.
Education.
Yeah.
Calculate risk.
Risk? Risk taking, did I hear? Yeah. Education.
Exercise.
Yeah. Risk taking.
Pushing boundaries.
So when you say pushing boundaries, what do they need? Set boundaries.
They need to be allowed to push boundaries and be controlled rather than being slapped down. They need to be persuaded.
Guided.
So guidance, yes. That's good. Okay, one more then.
Confidence.
Confidence, yeah, I'll do. And actually there's lots and lots of things, isn't there? And none of these are special in that sense. These are things that you would expect every child, sorry, I'm going to move, that you'd expect every child to experience. And if a child experiences something like that, it creates a really good foundation, doesn't it, to build the rest of your life on. It looks like the early kind of foundation of a wall. And for most people, we'd hope that they'd have that kind of experience. You might not have all of the bricks in there, but hopefully there's enough to make it stable. Now, for the kind of children that we're talking about who have had a very chaotic start in life or have not had their needs met for whatever reason, they may still be in that environment or they may be in the care system. Let's think about what their early experience might look like. So there's probably not going to be an awful lot of cuddling going on in this home if there's lots of things happening and they haven't got the time or the the capacity to do that. Food. For those of you that work with families like this, you'll know that food is often an issue with children, and as they grow up it becomes a really big issue. If they haven't had enough food, they haven't had the right kind of food at the right stages of development, can mean that that becomes a really big issue. And this is one that I've struggled to understand, that a child can be out of that environment and have 3 meals a day for 10 years and it still have an impact. So much so that it affects their schooling, it affects how they feel about things, it affects so many things because it's about survival, isn't it? Do any of you watch I'm a Celebrity? You're going to admit to it. I watch it with my children, we love it. And what I like about it is it gets down to the actual basics of survival, doesn't it? It's always about there isn't enough food, and that changes everybody's whole personality. Anyway, sleep, so there's not going to be a lot of routine of sleep in this home, because there's lots of comings and goings. As soon as you get to sleep, something else happens. There aren't any routines. Warmth, there may not be an awful lot of warmth going on. I can't read my own writing, what does that say? Comfort, thank you. There's probably not a lot of comfort. Shelter might not be adequate for children, and often as they grow up, their body temperatures, they don't understand when they should be wearing different things. I often have to tell mine, it's a bit hot to be wearing that, or you need to be putting your coat on. Hygiene is probably not going to be there. Play, they often don't know how to play or know how to share, and when they come into school, they come into reception, where we do a lot of child-led play, they find that really, really difficult because it's unstructured and they don't know how to play. Communication, so in this family there might be a lot of language, a lot of communication going on, but not necessarily positive. Not a lot of interaction, certainly won't be being read to probably. It's not going to feel very safe. Stimulation tends to be these days lots and lots of stimulation to do with screens. Somebody told me the other day that somebody's invented an iPad holder for a pram. Yeah, so that we're actually going more that way, aren't we? That screens and things are babysitting our children instead of people. Praise, not a lot of praise, probably not a lot of boundaries. Love, I always tend to leave love on here because I don't often think it's about parents not loving their children. I think it's about not being able to look after them. It's not, you know. Rules, now there might be rules that tend to be quite harsh discipline, as I said earlier, with my daughter for basic needs. So it's not kind of how we would talk about boundaries and things and rules. Socialising tend to be with older siblings often, not supervised and structured by adults. Education, so they have a formal education because they have to start to come into school, but they've probably never done any education at home, any of the things that we might think about, so it's all very alien when they come into that classroom environment. Risk taking won't have been done properly with them. Exercise as well, probably. Guidance certainly is not going there. And confidence, it's hard to feel confident about yourself, and I would put identity in that as well, is if you haven't had those other things, it's kind of hard to have good self-esteem because we need all those basics in order to feel good about ourselves. So it's a very different picture, isn't it, to what it looked like before, and to be able to build your life on something like that is really quite difficult for children. And what we tend to do is we pile loads of stuff on here, so when they come into school particularly, they just start doing things that are normal, like having rewards and treats, and often children like this can't accept those, so they get given a sticker for doing something and they go and punch somebody in the face, or they get given a certificate and they tear it up, because actually they haven't got the resilience down here. They don't feel good about themselves, and you're telling them they've done something good, they can't accept that level of praise. There might be opportunities to go on a trip and they sabotage it when they're on the trip. If they go into care, so if they come out of this environment and go into care, what we do in care is we give them all the stuff we think is normal that they should have already experienced. And then we say things like, they're very ungrateful, you know, they don't want to do what we want to do. Do you know what I mean? And it's because they haven't got a solid enough foundation down here. And a lot of what we talk about, certainly in our training, and I believe is what you're trying to do, is to fill in these gaps, is to help families particularly, because that's where it should be happening, within relationship, within families, to fill in those gaps. Instead of piling more on top, to actually be filling those gaps so that children can grow in the right way in the future. Does that make sense? Okay, moving on. How much time do we have? Oh, okay, good. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about brain development. Some of you, I'm sure, will have done this before. But this was a revelation to me when I first came across this, particularly with our children, and trying to get away from the belief that they know what they're doing in terms of their behaviour, that it's all, that it's manipulative and that it's controlling. A lot of it is not, they're not conscious of what they're doing. It comes from a place of fear to do with where they are in their brain. So, what I mean by that is when we're born, our brains develop from the bottom up, from the inside out. And the further out you get, the more complex the brain structure becomes. And it's basically split into three areas. And the first part to develop is the back part of the brain, here behind the brain stem, which is known as the reptilian brain. And that's where all your kind of survival instincts live. So your heart rate, your respiratory rate, fight, flight, freeze mechanism lives in the back part of your brain. And then through repetitive patterned activity with people around us, the rest of the brain develops. So then the middle section, the limbic system, which we call the emotional brain, and then finally the neocortex, frontal cortex, which we call the thinking brain, at the front of our brain here. And that's where you are right now, hopefully. That's where we spend most of our time, as we're thinking. So that's where we do any reasoning, problem solving, reflection, any kind of creative thinking, recognising familiar faces. All of that happens in the front part of your brain. Now the way that the brain is set up is really clever in that the back part of the brain and the front part of the brain cannot work together at the same time. They can't both be online. And the reason for that is if you went out of here today, went across the main road, and a car spun around the corner and surprised you, you wouldn't just stop in the middle of the road and go, right, what shall we do? What are my options? You know, I can run over there, I can run back to that pavement, I can lie down and see if it'll swerve around me, I can phone a friend. Don't do any of that, hopefully. The front part of your brain shuts down, the back part fires up, and you run. Or you freeze, let's hope you run. All thought goes out of the window, you are just reacting to your environment. Earlier on when we were setting up, one of the balloons burst, as I'm sure another one might at some point. If that happens, there will be a startle response of varying degrees between us, but then what will happen is our front part of our brain will kick in and say, it's okay, it's just a balloon, nothing to worry about. Because our brains have developed in the right way. For children who've been born into a chaotic home environment, or who haven't had their needs met for whatever reason, what has happened when their brain was developing, the back part of the brain is overdeveloped. It's hypersensitive, it's kind of on red alert. So for us, most of the time we're in the front part of our brain. For them, most of the time they're in the back part of their brain. Particularly when they're in stressful environments, if they're in a school environment where there's lots of children, lots of people coming and going, if they're in a new place, they're going to be in the back part of the brain, which means the front part is shut down. So when we try and reason with them, they're not going to be able to do that because they're in that fear part of the brain. And it's quite frustrating for people because sometimes they can do something. So one day they might be able to do their 7 times table, and the next day they can't. And then we say things like, you know, they're just messing around, they're lazy, they know what they're doing. That might be the case, but often it's because they're not in the right space in their brain. They don't feel safe and they don't feel calm. And a lot of the trauma for children happens in relationships and in families. So a lot of that, if you come into a home environment and you see a lot of this kind of chaotic living going on, for that child, they may very well be in that back part of the brain all the time. So they are just reacting. They can't think through. It's a fear response. It's like survival. Does that make sense? So actually it's about trying to help them to feel calm and to feel safe, not sitting down and doing the, you know, why did you do that? Let's talk about that, and let's talk about, you know, cause and effect and all those kind of things. That doesn't really work at that moment in time. Okay, are there any questions at this point? Because I'm aware I'm just going straight.
Is there not a way that you can train the brain, because at the end of it it's muscle, to calm the back end and grow the front more? Absolutely,
yeah. Yeah, but you've got to, I think the operative word to use there is to train. So somebody's got to do that for them, and particularly when they're children. So another way of looking at it is that the emotional part of the brain, in that part of the brain is something called the hippocampus, and what that does is it soothes the reptilian part of the brain. But these children, that hippocampus is really tiny. So what we have to do as adults helping them is we step in and we are the hippocampus for them. So when they're having a tantrum because they've lost their mobile phone at 15, and I know some of you in here might have a tantrum as well if you lost your mobile phone, but we need to be the one who's calming them down because they don't have the mechanism in their brain to do that. Over time, yes, you can rewire the brain, and that's what's different about attachment to other conditions. I've heard autism talked about, we mentioned a few times today, fetal alcohol syndrome. They all look very similar in terms of symptoms, but the big difference is that they are lifelong conditions, they're long-term things. Attachment isn't necessarily. You can work on rewiring the brain.
And can I sort of, I'm sure everybody has picked it up, but what you're describing, and you're describing it in the child, is what we often meet in the parent.
Absolutely.
Because the parent has come from that
Yep.
sort of background.
Yeah. Well, that's what this is, isn't it? That's the cycle. So these children grow up and they become parents, and and that's my main aim as an adopter, is to break that cycle for my children. And I know sometimes it doesn't happen. I know lots of, you know, adopted children who go back into that lifestyle because it is so ingrained. It's very hard to break the cycle, actually, and you'll know more than any, I
It
suppose.
explains a lot to me, you know, when you think you're dealing with a mother who is doing, you know, those sorts of, would almost appear to write it off to say, well, they're being childish or manipulative or something. When you see it like that, it makes
Absolutely, yeah. And the other emphasise is they're not the same age emotionally as they are chronologically. So particularly children, but also adults, because they've missed stages of development. So we all regress when we're stressed, we're pleased to know, but hopefully we don't regress too far and we bounce back quite quick. But for adults or children who are really stressed, if their brains haven't developed properly as they should have done in those early years, they will regress quite far. So you can have 20-year-olds who are acting like a 10-year-old. Our brains aren't mature brains until 25, 30. So if you think the moms that you know that have had children around that age or before then, their brains aren't matured enough. And if they've come from this kind of background, then definitely it will have an impact here. Okay, yeah, go. Can't remember what's next. Okay, this really is just about another part of the brain is to do with the connections around the brain. So when we're born with billions of cells within our brain called synapses. And the idea is through repetitive patterned activity again, with people around us, these cells connect and make good, strong connections. And you get to a point at about 2 where you've got really solid connections around the brain. So it shows how important those first 2 years are. We're born with more of these cells than we need because it goes through a pruning process. So every so often, the brain looks at these cells and says, right, do we need this? Are we actually using this? No, and it just falls away. So if you think about empathy, for example, empathy is something that starts to develop early in life through mirroring. So I smile at baby smiles at me, I point, baby points. That relationship you see going on, that's starting to develop empathy for the child. They're starting to understand there's something outside of me and I have an impact on the world around me. But if they're not experiencing that kind of relationship for whatever reason, parts of the brain to do with empathy don't connect properly. And then later in life, when you say to them, how would you feel if so-and-so had done that to you? And they go, I don't care, look on me. Because actually they don't understand what it is about other people. It's really important what's happening. Now there are other windows in our development where the brain is open for more rewiring, which is what we were talking about earlier. It doesn't mean that by 2, that's it. There's lots of opportunity to do more rewiring of the brain, to change some of those patterns. It's really hard to do it. So you have to be working very close with people to be able to do that, and they have to feel calm and feel safe, and that's difficult when they don't trust people. You'll know, those of you that work with families, building that trust is quite difficult. It takes a long time. Okay, 5 minutes. Ooh. I'll quickly go through this. What's next? Let's just see. Okay, attachment styles. I just want to touch a little bit on this. There are 4 attachment styles that we have. The first is a secure that I mentioned earlier. So this is when somebody's had a healthy attachment cycle, good enough parenting, which means that they know parents will come back for them and will return. If you think about it in a school environment, they trust people in general, so they tend to trust people until they prove them wrong. They hit their usual child development milestones. They are open to learn and respond appropriately. And what they're saying is, I'm okay and you're okay. Generally, they feel quite safe in the world. Real generalisation, but that's, There's 3 types of insecure attachment. So there's an avoidance style, and for this child, their main aim in life is to not be noticed. These are the ones in school that tend to stay under the radar because they're very compliant, they're self-reliant. We didn't talk about independence, sometimes that comes up here, but you can't be truly independent unless you've been truly dependent on people. And for these children, they haven't been able to depend on adults, so they've developed self-reliance instead, which is very different. They're compliant, desperate to be liked, they don't trust people, they find it difficult to get close, they will not ask for help. And what they're saying is, I'm okay, you're not okay. So adults are not safe for them because of their experiences. So they will not come close to adults. An ambivalent child, on the other scale, is their main aim in life is to be noticed. And we tend to know who these children are. They're a bit louder, a bit more in your face. They have endearing personalities, so even though they're quite difficult to manage, they have something about them that draws you to them. Because the whole strategy is about keeping adults close. It shows in many different forms, so they might be aggressive, they might be angry, they also might mess around a lot and be quite fizzy and giggly and those kind of things. Attention needing, we talk about, not attention seeking. Because when you talk about attention seeking behaviour, it kind of implies that if you just ignore it, they'll stop. Yeah, these children won't. They hike it up to something else and then cartwheeling across the carpet. They will do whatever they can to get attention because it's a need, it's a drive. If they don't feel that they're being seen by people, they feel invisible. So they will do whatever they can. And they're saying, I'm not okay, you're okay, I need adults to make me feel safe. And then the disorganised, probably the most difficult, they tend to end up in kind of special education or alternative provisions because they don't have a clear approach or a strategy. So they are push-pull, they want you, they don't want you. They can be very erratic and controlling, unpredictable. They tend to come from domestic violence type backgrounds where the carer might have been frightened down and frightening. So unpredictability. And basically they're saying, I'm not okay and you're not okay. There's nowhere for them to go to feel safe. It's really quite difficult to work with children who've got a disorganised attachment. I just wanted to mention this because some of you working kind of more in the families and parenting space, you probably haven't come across a man called Brian Post. He tends to work within the adoption field. He's an American psychologist. He's an adoptee himself. He's also an adopter. He's a social worker. He's worked with children and really difficult in children's homes and things over in the States. And what he talks about is that there are basically two ways of parenting. There's fear-based parenting and there's love-based parenting. And some of this is quite American in the words, so I'll apologise for that. But what he means by that is most of what we do in this country is fear-based parenting. So we do time out, so we take things off children. There's grounding, there's thinking about the consequences of what you've done. There's lots of punishment. There's spanking, obviously we don't do that, but in the States they might do, I guess. Behaviour modification, a lot of it is about trying to get children to behave in the way that we think is appropriate. And it's a little bit like puppy training, to be honest, particularly in schools it is. If they can sit still, then we'll give them a sticker. That's the way that we tend to work in this country. And some of those things are okay if you have a child who's had a secure attachment. So if they know that as soon as mum looks at them in a kind of way, they stop what they're doing. Because they have that relationship, they're secure in who they are. If you do that, some of these things with children who don't have a secure attachment, one, it doesn't work, but also it can be quite harmful to them. So for example, the difference between time out and time in. So we tend to talk about time in, which is bringing a child to you. So we don't do any naughty steps, any sending them to their room, anything that is seen as a rejection. We don't do that with children like this because they've already experienced a lot of that. A lot of our school system sanctions are based around shame, loss and rejection. You lose lots of things. Obviously exclusions is the ultimate of we can't handle you as a school, so you need to go somewhere else. And we do it in the home as well. A lot of these kind of approaches come out in the home. So we tend to focus more on time in. So actually when a child is really struggling with something, and we know it's to do with the brain and it's to do with survival, it would be really difficult to then send them away and say, go and deal with that yourself. When we know that actually they can't deal with that emotion. They need an adult to regulate their emotion because they haven't had that in their early experience. So we would do a lot of trying to bring them to you before they've thrown a chair across the room. So if you can if you can step back and be more proactive and say, well, I can see that my child is starting to get a little bit dysregulated, come and spend some time with me in the kitchen. As soon as I hear my boys starting to fight or argue with each other, I will take the one who I can hear is the most dysregulated into the kitchen with me. I don't like it. There'll be lots of kicking about it, but I know he can't actually cope with that environment of where he is. And sending him to his room would just make it worse. Make sense? Yeah. Time. Okay. So are there any questions about any of that? Even though we've come even though we've come to time. No. So there's some further reading for you, and there's my contact details in your pack if you want to talk to me about anything. I'll obviously be around all afternoon, so come and see me if you want to talk about something. So I hope that's been helpful. I know you're all in different.
Very helpful indeed.